How's it going, everyone? You're with Rafa, the Pickleball Tech Dude, and welcome to a mini-series that I'm calling Pickleball Mythbusters. There's a lot of open debate over whether or not the paddles that pros play with are the same as their paddles that are sold retail to customers. I can tell you straight up right now, they are not the same paddles. But within that same debate is also a lot of talk about the different ways that pros may or may not be modifying their paddles on the down low in order to pass initial on-site paddle inspection and then either be very close to the breaking point or reach that breaking point a lot faster during that day of play, making their paddle hit much harder. So in this series, I'm going to be taking paddles of different construction types and applying these modification methods to them to reveal if there's any truth to them causing paddles to hit harder. Really quickly, before we dive into this week's method, I'm going to go ahead and get the obvious out of the way. I am not endorsing in any way, shape, or form the use of any of these methods to modify your paddle. In fact, you'll probably void your warranty on that paddle if you do. So leave this to me, the professional. Secondly, my use of any pickleball products or lack thereof should not be taken as an endorsement of those products. I have never been paid to use any pickleball products nor speak about any of them on my channel. I'm truly just trying to find the most representative paddles of a certain construction type so that I can apply these methods. Now, finally, with all of that out of the way, let's get into myth number 1. The first myth I was ever told about how to make your paddle hit harder that I felt had any kind of weight to it was putting your paddle in the freezer. One of the main things that everyone who's a paddle owner should know is that you should never leave your paddle in extreme heat or extreme cold, as both can cause damage to your paddle. Extreme cold can cause the resin or other adhesives used to keep your face sheets and your core of your paddle together to break apart or become brittle. And while this is an essential step in how paddles break in the first place, taking this too far can lead to delamination of your face sheets from your core or for the face sheets to disbond from each other. So in theory, putting your paddle in the freezer should produce these characteristics, which in many cases do cause paddles to degrade to benefit or hit harder than they are legally allowed to. So the mission is simple, but I first had to select paddles that are representative of different construction types and then get out on the court with them to recall how they feel. For this episode, I decided to go with all paddles that were around similar core thicknesses, all raw carbon fiber, and were elongated paddle shapes. I chose the PaddleTech Bantam TKOC 14.3mm to represent Gen 1, the Mark Unmarked Alpha to represent Gen 2, the Yola Perseus Gen 3S 16mm to represent Gen 3, and the SELKIRK 008 Invicta 16mm to represent Gen 4. The PaddleTech Bantam was just as I remembered it, a very stable paddle and offering a lot more forgiveness of sweet spot than the 12.7mm variant. It is already in the high power, high pop category of sorts, but nothing too crazy, and overall reminded me why it was still one of my favorite paddles that was launched last year. While the ball does exit off the face quickly of this paddle, it's very easy to place your shots and control the ball because of the forgiveness of the 14.3mm core, as well as the Gen 1 construction, allowing you to feel more of the ball vibrations since there is no edge foam injections. By the way, if after this any of you are looking for more in-depth reviews of these paddles, I've definitely talked about them in the reviews on my channel, so feel free to go check those out. I just reviewed the Mark Unmarked Alpha, and nothing has really changed from that review. Still a more muted ball feel experience, but not so much that you can't feel the ball. And in terms of power, very much more on the all-court side as opposed to power. But what the paddle sort of lacks in power and lacks in ability to feel the ball, it more than makes up for inability to place shots with very easy ball control and insane levels of spin. With the Yola Perseus 3S, I did decide to take one that was relatively new, which is different from the other paddles that I'm testing here. But what I'm really testing for, again, is just any difference in feel and power level by the end. The 3S reminded me why I think the Pro 4 is so much better, particularly from a ball feel perspective, especially right out the box. The 3S has a sweet spot that is average, but overall feels very stiff and rigid to the touch. However, it's still a paddle that I would characterize as high power and high pop, similar to the PaddleTech Bantams. And finally, with the SELKIRK 008, this is a paddle that is getting the Invicta in the 16mm shape for the first time since last week. and I've been hitting with this paddle and talking about it for a bit in my podcast with Aaron. And overall, not much of my opinion has changed. It's a very, very solid control paddle. Definitely not even close to all court, very control oriented. Not much to complain about in terms of stability or sweet spot size or anything like that. The dwell time is very strong. So overall, a pretty concretely solid control paddle. One of the better ones that I've hit this year, but I do think that the Maxima shape is significantly better, offers significantly more. The last thing that I did was power test all of these paddles, and these are the results after averaging over 20 serves. So keeping this data in mind and everything that I've talked about in terms of what I feel on these paddles, let's go ahead and head to the freezer, and I'll see you guys after the next hitting session. All right, y'all, we are back after session 2, and I have some pretty interesting results. So to give a little bit more context, after I took the paddles out of the fridge, I ended up setting them outside in the sun for a little bit to kind of return to normal temperature, as I felt like it would be a little bit too obvious to paddle testers if people were showing up with paddles that just felt extremely cold. Despite the fact that this entire myth-busting process is kind of a practice in how do we reduce durability and fast-track break-in of paddles, there were a couple of concerns that I had purely based on this method, and the first was the amount of moisture on the paddles. Raw carbon fiber face paddles essentially have woven cloth as the face materials and are held together by glue, so having moisture, you can imagine, isn't a great thing. The second thing that I noticed, and this is probably also due to the moisture that entered the paddles, is that the faces felt extremely rigid, like the moisture had entered the paddles first, and then the freezing temperatures caused that moisture to freeze and cause the paddle faces to really stiffen up. It didn't bode well when I was literally about to go hit a plastic ball hundreds of times. But in any case, let's get into the results. Essentially, my process entailed getting a good 25 to 30 minute drill session of mostly drives and drops with each of the paddles using a Titan ball machine, which by the way is my favorite machine for drilling, and you can get a discount using my link in the description. While this doesn't perfectly simulate a full day of gameplay post putting your paddle in the freezer, it does give the paddles significant amount of time to break in if they were going to do so. And after this, I went and I power tested the paddles once more. I originally planned to spend a few minutes on each paddle talking about the differences in feel, but the interesting thing about this is the only paddle that felt significantly different was the Yola Perseus 3S. The Paddletech Bantam 14.3 felt a little bit looser, a little bit more forgiving, and felt a slight boost in power, but the Perseus 3S in comparison lost a lot of the stiffness and feel I was talking about before, had a significantly deeper thud sound to it, and definitely felt more powerful. I felt almost little to no change in terms of playing experience on the Mark Unmarked Alpha or the 008 Invicta 16mm. And this experience definitely backs up my results from the power testing that I conducted after the drill session, which I will show you now. You'll notice here exactly what I was mentioning before. The Mark Unmarked Alpha and the 008 Invicta 16mm both had very slight increases in power and are honestly within the realm of variance from my previous day of serving. The Paddletech did have a more noticeable increase in power, but again, it's very slight and it does bump it up a little bit in terms of percentile rankings, but that's only because there's only 200-ish or so paddles in my database so far. The real story here is with the Yola Perseus 3S 16mm, where we do see a significant increase in power compared to the baseline. So what the data suggests is that Gen 3 paddles, or maybe even more specifically paddles constructed similar to Yola's propulsion core, are actually affected and modified by this freezing method. And so in the end, again, while I'm not actively emphasizing the use of this method, nor am I stating that any pros actively use this method at all, it would make sense why it might be a popular method on pros, simply by looking at the numbers. Think about the number of players that are not sponsored that decide to use Yola paddles. Then think about the number of pro players that Yola does actively sponsor. And then go a step further and think about the number of paddles that use a similar Gen 3 construction type to Yola's propulsion core. Think about the Franklin C45 and the Proton Flamingo in particular. I'm not sure what those numbers are, but just thinking about what that proportion could look like off the top of my head, again, it would make sense how this method could be widespread in popularity among pros, especially if it can pass initial paddle inspection. The Perseus 3S felt a little bit looser upon the first couple of hits, but then really loosened up, developed the deeper thud and the harder hitting power when I really think about it, probably 5 or 10 minutes into my hitting session, indicating that it's possible using this method could allow you to pass that initial test. The odds that your paddle passes becomes even more likely if you're allowed to test 6, 7, 8, or 9 paddles at a time, like we've been hearing in some cases, as long as you get one to pass the on-site. And all this does is make me curious about the extent to which the methods we'll be testing in future weeks affect performance of Gen 3s and whether or not we can get it to impact Gen 1, 2, or 4 paddles. But we'll just have to see. So if you made it here to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. Per usual, make sure you like, subscribe, comment down below any thoughts you have about this method or anything you think could help these tests be even more helpful in the future. And I hope you all stay happy and healthy. And of course, out on the courts and out of the freezer. Until the next video. Peace.